20 years had passed since the Battle of Zephyr Prime, and the galaxy had become a place that Jake Morrison would barely recognize. The Zephyrian Empire was nothing but a memory kept alive in history books and museum displays. The worlds that had once trembled under alien oppression now governed themselves as free democracies, united by trade agreements and mutual defense pacts instead of fear and conquest. Commander Lisa Morrison stood before the Memorial of Heroes on New Earth and felt the weight of a name she carried with pride and sorrow. She was 21 years old and wore the blue uniform of the Galactic Liberation Alliance peacekeeping forces. Her father's genetic material had been preserved by Dr. Helen Carter during the dark years of the war, and Lisa had been born into a world where freedom was possible because of sacrifices made by people she would never meet. New Earth was humanity's second attempt at building a home among the stars. The planet was smaller than the original world, and its oceans were purple instead of blue, but it had clean air and open spaces where children could play without fear of alien bombardment. Cities of glass and steel rose from fertile plains, while orbital elevators carried goods and people between the surface and the thriving space stations that served as gateways to the rest of the galaxy. Lisa had grown up hearing stories about her father from the veterans who remembered the war. General Patricia Lane had been like a grandmother to her and told tales of the impossible missions that Jake Morrison had led with nothing but courage and determination. Vex Korath visited every year on the anniversary of the final battle and shared memories of the human who had saved his people and countless others from a life of running and hiding among the stars. The memorial itself was a simple stone wall, carved with the names of everyone who had died in the fight against the Zephyrian Empire. Jake Morrison's name was near the top of the list, not because he was more important than the others, but because his sacrifice had come at the moment when victory hung in the balance. Below his name were carved the words he had transmitted in his final moments before the quantum beacon facility exploded around his damaged fighter. We are not defined by what we lose, but by how we choose to rise again. Let my sacrifice be the foundation upon which free peoples build their future. Those words had become the unofficial motto of the Liberation Alliance and were taught to children in schools throughout the galaxy. They represented the best of what humanity had to offer and the hope that even the darkest times could lead to something better. Lisa touched her father's name with gentle fingers and wondered what he would think of the world they had built on the ruins of his sacrifice. The Alliance maintained peacekeeping forces on 100 worlds and mediated disputes between species that had once been bitter enemies. Former Zephyrian colonies were rebuilding their cultures while former slaves learned to live as free beings again. It was not perfect, but it was better than anything the galaxy had known for over 1,000 years. The memorial was crowded today because it was Liberation Day, when beings from across the galaxy came to remember the price of their freedom. Lisa saw humans and Kravani standing together while Thakarian families explained the meaning of the ceremony to their young ones. Former enemies shared the same space and breathed the same air because Jake Morrison and thousands of others had proven that cooperation was stronger than conquest. Dr. Helen Carter approached the memorial using a walking stick to support her aging frame. She was over 70 now, but her mind was still sharp and her dedication to preserving the truth about the war had never wavered. Helen had written the definitive history of the Phoenix Coalition and made sure that future generations would understand the real cost of the freedom they enjoyed. She nodded to Lisa with the respect that one veteran shows to another, even though Lisa had never seen combat herself. Together, they watched a group of young beings from a dozen different species laying flowers at the base of the memorial wall. These children had been born into freedom and took it for granted the way young people always did. But their teachers made sure they understood that liberty was not free and that someone had paid for their peaceful lives with blood and sacrifice. The stories would be passed down from one generation to the next so that the lessons of the war would never be forgotten. Lisa thought about her own role in the Alliance and the missions she had flown to protect civilian populations from pirates and warlords who tried to fill the power vacuum left by the Empire's collapse. She was a good pilot and a capable officer, but she would never be the legend that her father had become. Jake Morrison's name was spoken with reverence on worlds he had never visited by beings he had never met. His tactical doctrines were studied in military academies, and his speeches were memorized by anyone who fought for justice against oppression. But perhaps the greatest tribute to Jake Morrison's memory was not the memorial or the speeches or the history books. It was the simple fact that children could grow up in a galaxy where freedom was normal and tyranny was the exception. Lisa had never known the fear that had driven her father to sacrifice everything because his sacrifice had made such fear unnecessary for her generation. As the sun set over New Earth's purple seas, Lisa Morrison walked away from the memorial knowing that her father's work was complete. Jake Morrison had lost everything when Earth fell, but in losing everything he had gained something more valuable than any personal happiness. He had become proof that the human spirit could transform terrible loss into unstoppable hope, and that even in the darkest hour one person's refusal to surrender could change the fate of billions. The stars themselves seemed to whisper his story to anyone who would listen. It was the tale of a man who lost his world, his family, and his life, but in the end gained immortality as the legend who freed the galaxy from 1,000 years of darkness. Jake Morrison had become exactly what the universe needed, not just a hero, but a symbol that even in defeat humanity would never truly fall. Jake Morrison stared at the intelligence report in his hands and felt the familiar cold anger begin to burn in his chest. The Zephyrian Empire was preparing to deploy something called the World Render against suspected coalition strongholds. According to Dr. Helen Carter's analysis, the weapon could crack a planet's core and turn an entire world into a cloud of superheated gas and broken rock. The first target would be New Geneva, where 50,000 human colonists lived in ignorance of their approaching doom. The Phoenix coalition had grown strong over the past 2 years, but they were still no match for the Empire's main battle fleets in open combat. Jake's forces specialized in hit-and-run tactics that avoided direct confrontation with superior numbers and firepower. Now they faced a choice between watching innocent worlds die or attempting something that every tactical manual said was impossible. They would have to strike at the heart of Zephyrian power itself. Helen's research had revealed a critical weakness in the enemy's hyperspace navigation network. Every Zephyrian fleet relied on quantum beacons located on their capital world to coordinate faster than light travel across the galaxy. If those beacons were destroyed or disabled, the Empire's vast armadas would be blind and scattered, unable to communicate or maneuver effectively. It was the kind of target that could change the course of the war with a single successful mission. The problem was reaching Zephyr Prime itself. The capital world was protected by orbital defense platforms that could destroy a battle fleet and surrounded by patrol squadrons that never slept. Even if the coalition could somehow fight through the outer defenses, they would still face the impossible task of penetrating the planet's surface installations while under constant attack from above. It was a suicide mission that would almost certainly fail. Jake called together his senior commanders in the main briefing room of Phoenix Base. General Patricia Lane sat across from him wearing the improvised uniform of the Coalition's human forces. Vex Korath represented the alien refugees who had joined their cause, while Dr. Carter provided the scientific expertise that made their operations possible. These were the people Jake trusted most in the galaxy, and he was about to ask them to follow him into almost certain death. He laid out the situation with brutal honesty. The World Render would be ready for deployment within 30 days, and there was no way to evacuate all the potential target worlds in time. The Coalition's only chance was to destroy the hyperspace beacons on Zephyr Prime before the weapon could be properly coordinated with the main fleet. It would require every ship they possessed, and the lives of everyone willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were talking about attacking the most heavily defended world in the galaxy with forces that were barely adequate for raiding supply convoys. Patricia Lane was the first to speak, and her words carried the weight of a lifetime spent in military service. She said that sometimes impossible missions were the only ones worth attempting because they were the only ones that could make a real difference. Vex spoke for the alien refugees who had lost everything to Zephyrian expansion. His people had been running and hiding for too long while the Empire grew stronger and consumed more worlds. If they were going to die anyway, it was better to die fighting for something greater than mere survival. The other commanders nodded in agreement, and Jake realized that despite the odds, they were all willing to follow him into the fire one last time. The assault on Zephyr Prime began with a diversionary attack on the outer systems defense platforms. Jake led half the Coalition fleet in a desperate charge that drew most of the enemy forces away from the capital world itself. While the main battle raged among the orbital stations, a small strike force commanded by Patricia Lane slipped through the chaos and headed for the planet's surface. Jake's role in the final phase required him to pilot a single fighter through the quantum beacon facility's defenses while his friends provided covering fire from increasingly desperate positions. The beacon complex was buried deep underground and protected by energy shields that could only be penetrated from specific angles at precise moments. It was the kind of flying that required perfect timing, superhuman reflexes, and more luck than any reasonable person should expect to have as Jake dove toward the target through a storm of defensive fire. He thought about all the people counting on this mission's success. Patricia Lane and her assault teams were fighting their way through underground tunnels while Vex led the evacuation of wounded Coalition forces from the orbital battle. Dr. Carter was coordinating the attack from her position on one of the command ships and risking her life to provide Jake with real-time updates on the beacon facility's defenses. The final approach felt like it lasted forever and ended in an instant. Jake's fighter was hit repeatedly as he lined up for the killing blow, but the small ship held together just long enough to complete its mission. He fired everything he had at the quantum beacon's control center and watched the massive structure begin to collapse in a cascade of explosions that lit up the underground complex. Like a miniature sun, Jake's ship was caught in the blast wave and crushed like an insect between giant hands. In his last moments, he thought about Lisa and Amy and the home they had built together before the war destroyed everything he loved. He thought about Earth's blue skies and green fields and the laughter of children playing in peaceful gardens. He thought about the future that the Coalition might build if his sacrifice bought them enough time to finish what they had started. The destruction of the quantum beacons crippled the Zephyrian fleet just as Helen Carter had predicted. Without coordination from the capital world, the scattered task forces became easy targets for Coalition forces that struck them one by one. The world render was captured before it could be deployed, and its terrible power was turned against the Empire's own strongholds. Within months, the Zephyrian military collapsed and their subject worlds began declaring independence. Jake Morrison died as he had lived in the final years of his life by putting the welfare of others ahead of his own survival. His name was unknown to most of the beings he saved, and his grave was an unmarked patch of ground on a world that had been bombed into glass and ash. But his sacrifice became the foundation upon which free peoples throughout the galaxy built their hopes for a better tomorrow. The war was won, but the price of victory was measured in the lives of heroes who would never see the peace they had died to create. Jake Morrison stood in the command center of Phoenix Base and studied the holographic display showing Zephyrian fleet movements across 3 star systems. The hidden asteroid base had grown from a single hollowed-out rock to a sprawling complex of tunnels and chambers that housed 5,000 beings from dozens of species. Human refugees worked alongside Corvani engineers and Thakarian medics while Shelthan pilots trained on captured enemy fighters. It was the largest gathering of free peoples in this part of the galaxy, and they all looked to Jake for leadership. 6 months had passed since the evacuation of Freeport Station, and the Phoenix Coalition had struck the Zephyrian Empire again, and again with lightning raids that seemed to come from nowhere. Jake's forces would hit supply convoys, communications relays, and isolated outposts before vanishing back into the dark spaces between stars. Each victory brought new refugees and volunteers who had heard stories of the human commander who fought like a ghost and struck like lightning. The Coalition's greatest triumph came when Jake learned about a massive prison complex called Kepler Station, where the Zephyrians held thousands of slaves from conquered worlds. The facility was built into a dead moon and protected by a fleet of warships that should have made any attack impossible. Traditional military doctrine said that assaulting such a heavily defended position would require 10 times as many ships as the attackers possessed. Jake had a different idea. Working with Dr. Helen Carter and his alien allies, Jake developed a plan that no Zephyrian commander would expect. Instead of attacking from outside, they would strike from within. Using captured enemy vessels and forged identification codes, a small fleet would approach the station as if delivering new prisoners. Once inside the defensive perimeter, they would coordinate with resistance cells that Helen had secretly contacted through hidden communication channels. The mission required perfect timing and incredible courage from everyone involved. Jake would lead the main assault team while Vex commanded the escape fleet that would evacuate the freed prisoners. Zara had modified their ships with hidden weapons and shield generators, while Grix had prepared demolition charges to destroy the station's power systems. Even the newest recruits had vital roles to play in the complex operation. Jake felt the familiar cold focus settle over him as their small fleet approached Kepler Station. He was wearing a captured Zephyrian uniform and carrying forged orders that identified him as a prison transport commander. His human features were hidden behind an alien-breathing mask that also disguised his voice. To the station's security forces, he was just another cog in the Empire's vast military machine. The deception worked perfectly until they reached the main docking bay. A suspicious guard began asking questions about their cargo manifest while scanning the ships with deep sensors that might reveal the hidden weapons. Jake felt time slipping away as more guards gathered around their position. In a few minutes, the entire plan would collapse and thousands of prisoners would remain in chains. Without hesitation, Jake triggered the hidden signal that began the uprising. Across the station, prisoners who had been secretly organized by resistance agents suddenly turned on their guards using improvised weapons and desperate courage. Alarms began screaming as explosions rocked the facility's power grid. In the confusion that followed, Jake's assault teams dropped their disguises and fought their way toward the main cell blocks. The battle for Kepler Station lasted 4 hours and became the stuff of legend throughout the galaxy. Jake led his forces through corridors filled with smoke and laser fire while freed prisoners joined the fight with captured weapons. The Zephyrian defenders were brave and well-trained, but they had never faced an enemy that fought with such desperate determination. Humans who had lost their worlds fought alongside aliens who had seen their families enslaved, and together they were unstoppable. The most dangerous moment came when Jake found himself face-to-face with General Patricia Lane, a former Earth Defense Force commander who had been captured during humanity's final battle. She was thin and scarred from months of imprisonment, but her eyes still burned with the fire that had made her one of Earth's greatest military leaders. When Jake freed her from her cell, she looked at him with recognition and something like wonder. Patricia Lane had heard rumors about the human resistance leader called the Phoenix, but she had not dared to believe the stories were true. Now she found herself following Jake Morrison through battles that reminded her of the old days when humans fought for their own world instead of someone else's freedom. Working together, they coordinated the evacuation of over 8,000 prisoners while holding off increasingly desperate Zephyrian counterattacks. The escape from Kepler Station was as dramatic as the assault itself. Jake's fleet fought a running battle through the defensive perimeter while overcrowded. Transport ships carried freed slaves toward hyperspace jump points. Several Coalition vessels were lost, including the modified freighter that Grix had been piloting. The four-armed mechanic died as he had lived working to fix something that was broken and protecting others who could not protect themselves. News of the Kepler Station raids spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The Zephyrian Empire tried to suppress the story, but too many witnesses had escaped and too many worlds had lost people to the prison complex. On planets throughout the Outer Rim, beings who had given up hope began to whisper about the Phoenix Coalition and its human leader who seemed to work miracles with impossible odds. Jake found himself commanding a movement that had grown far beyond anything he had imagined. The Coalition now operated from a dozen hidden bases and fielded a fleet of over 200 ships crewed by volunteers from 30 different species. Former Zephyrian slaves who had been freed at Kepler Station brought knowledge of enemy tactics and technology that made future operations even more effective, but success brought new dangers as well as new opportunities. The Zephyrian High Command had placed an enormous bounty on Jake's head and deployed elite Shadow Guard units to hunt him down. These were not regular soldiers but specially trained killers who had never failed to eliminate their targets. Jake knew that every day he remained alive was borrowed time, and every victory brought him closer to a final confrontation that he might not survive, standing in his command center surrounded by beings who trusted him with their lives and their hopes. Jake Morrison had become something he had never wanted to be. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge for his family's death. He had become a symbol of resistance against tyranny and a beacon of hope for the oppressed peoples of the galaxy. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing, but he carried it because he knew that no one else could bear it in his place. Word traveled fast through the hidden networks of refugee ships and underground trading posts. Stories spread about a human called the Ghost Walker who had fought off pirates and saved a Corvani salvage crew. In the dark spaces between star systems, where the desperate and displaced gathered to trade and share news, people began to whisper about the man who had survived Earth's destruction and learned to strike back. Jake Morrison was sitting in a cantina on Freeport Station when she found him. The space station was a ramshackle collection of old ships and habitat modules welded together in the shadow of a dead planet. It served as a meeting place for refugees, smugglers, and anyone else who needed to stay off the official star charts. Jake was drinking something that tasted like liquid metal and trying not to think about the anniversary of Earth's fall when a woman sat down across from him. She was human, which was rare enough in this part of space to make Jake look up from his drink. The woman appeared to be in her 40s with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She carried herself like someone who was used to being the smartest person in the room. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. Despite the dangerous surroundings, Dr. Helen Carter introduced herself as a former researcher from the Luna Science Institute who had escaped Earth's destruction with a small group of scientists and engineers. She had been looking for Jake for months, following rumors and half-truths through refugee communities across 3 sectors. Helen carried with her something that made Jake's blood run cold and hot at the same time. She had proof that other humans had survived and were planning to fight back. Helen spread a holographic display across the table showing locations of human settlements scattered throughout the Outer Rim territories. Some were colonies that had been established before Earth's fall. Others were refugee groups that had found planets to settle or asteroid bases to call home. Altogether, there were maybe 200,000 humans left alive in the galaxy. It was not many compared to the billions who had died, but it was more than Jake had dared to hope. The survivors were organizing. Helen explained in a voice barely above a whisper. They had leaders and resources and even some military equipment salvaged from the evacuation fleets. What they did not have was someone who could unite them and give them hope. They needed a symbol, a leader who had already proven that humans could strike back against impossible odds. They needed Jake Morrison. Jake wanted to say no immediately. The thought of being responsible for more lives, when he had already failed to save the ones that mattered most, made his hands shake. He had found a kind of peace working with Vex and the Corvani crew. It was not happiness, but it was better than the crushing despair he had felt for so long. Taking on leadership meant risking that fragile stability and opening old wounds that had barely begun to heal, but Helen was persistent, and she had brought more than just maps and population figures. She showed Jake recordings from human settlements, where children who had never seen Earth sang songs about the hero who had rammed the alien flagship. She played messages from former Earth Defense Force officers who were training farmers and miners to be soldiers again. Most importantly, she shared intelligence about Zephyrian military operations that made Jake's tactical mind start working despite his reluctance. The discussion was interrupted by alarms and shouting from the station's control center. A Zephyrian patrol had detected the base and was moving to investigate. Jake felt the familiar cold anger settle in his chest as he watched the alien ships approach on the sensor displays. These were the same type of vessels that had burned Earth and killed his family. Without thinking, he was already moving toward the docking bay, where his shuttle was berthed, found him checking the small ship's weapon systems, and tried to talk him out of whatever he was planning. The Kravani captain knew the look in Jake's eyes, and it worried him. But Jake was beyond listening to reason. He had spent 3 years learning alien technology and studying Zephyrian tactics. He knew their weaknesses and their blind spots. More importantly, he knew they would not expect a single human in a salvage shuttle to attack a military patrol. Jake's plan was simple and completely insane. He used the shuttle's civilian transponder to approach the Zephyrian ships while broadcasting a distress signal. The aliens were used to refugees begging for mercy, so they lowered their guards just enough for Jake to get close. When he was within weapons range, he dropped the pretense and opened fire with everything his small ship had. The shuttle's weapons were not powerful enough to seriously damage the alien vessels, but Jake was not trying to destroy them. He targeted their sensor arrays and communication equipment while using the station's bulk to block return fire. His human reflexes and unpredictable tactics confused the Zephyrian pilots who were trained to fight in organized formations, not deal with a single suicidal attacker. The distraction lasted just long enough for the station's population to evacuate. Hundreds of refugees escaped in hidden ships while the patrol was focused on the crazy human who dared to shoot at them. Jake's shuttle was shot to pieces, but he managed to reach an escape pod before the main hull exploded. He was picked up by Vex, who had ignored orders to evacuate and waited to rescue his human friend Dot as they watched Freeport Station burn. Jake felt something change inside him. The refugees who had escaped included families with children who would live to see another day because of what he had done. It was not enough to balance the scales for Earth or bring back Lisa and Amy, but it was something. Helen Carter was right. He could not hide among the stars forever while others suffered the same losses he had endured. That night, Jake made his decision. He would take command of the human resistance and do everything in his power to unite the scattered survivors. He would forge them into a weapon that could strike back at the Zephyrian Empire. It would probably cost him his life, but he had already died once when Earth fell. Everything since then was borrowed time that he could spend however he chose. The Phoenix Coalition was born in the ashes of Freeport Station, with a human who had lost everything as its heart and a galaxy full of refugees as its cause. Jake Morrison woke up in darkness and pain. His body felt like it had been torn apart and put back together wrong. Every breath hurt and he could taste blood in his mouth. Slowly his eyes adjusted to the dim light and he realized he was lying on a metal bed in some kind of medical bay. The walls were curved and covered with symbols he did not recognize. A figure moved in the shadows near the door. It was tall and thin with blue-gray skin and large dark eyes. Jake tried to sit up, but the alien creature made a gentle sound and pushed him back down with surprisingly careful hands. The being spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through metal tubes, but somehow Jake understood the meaning. Rest now. Heal first. Questions later. Days passed in a blur of strange medicines and careful treatment. Jake learned that he was aboard a salvage ship called the Wandering Star. The crew were Kravani refugees whose own world had been destroyed by the same aliens who had attacked Earth. They had found Jake floating in space inside a damaged escape pod 3 weeks after the battle. He should have been dead, but humans were apparently harder to kill than most species expected. The ship's captain was named Vex Korath, and he was older than he looked. His people aged slowly, but the weight of loss had carved deep lines around his eyes. Vex told Jake about the Zephyrian Empire and how they had been conquering worlds for over 1,000 years. Earth was just the latest planet to fall to their endless hunger for expansion and control. Jake wanted to scream or cry or hit something, but his body was still too weak. Instead, he lay in the medical bay and listened to Vex tell stories about dozens of dead civilizations. The Kravani had once been scientists and artists who lived on a world covered in crystal cities. Now they were scavengers picking through the wreckage of other people's dreams. The galaxy was full of refugees like them running from the same enemy. When Jake was finally strong enough to walk, Vex showed him around the ship. The wandering star was old and patched together from parts of a dozen different vessels. The crew of 20 worked with quiet efficiency born from years of survival in the dark spaces between worlds. They traded salvaged technology with other refugee groups and stayed far away from any system that might contain Zephyrian forces. Jake found himself working alongside aliens who had lost everything just like he had. There was Zara, a young Corvani engineer who had seen her parents killed in the first bombing. Grix was a four-armed mechanic from a world of endless storms, who now fixed broken things because he could not fix his broken home. Nyla was a tiny being with silver fur who had once been a teacher, but now handled the ship's communications and tried to keep everyone's spirits up. The work was simple, but it gave Jake something to focus on besides his grief. He learned to use alien tools and understand their technology. His human hands were clumsy at first, but he adapted quickly. The Corvani were impressed by how fast he picked up their methods and how he always seemed to find new ways to solve old problems. 3 months after his rescue, Jake was working in the cargo bay when pirates attacked the ship. The raiders were a mixed group of criminals from several species who preyed on refugee vessels. They had faster ships and better weapons than the salvage crew. Vex tried to negotiate, but the pirates wanted everything, including the ship itself. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he listened to the pirate demands. These criminals reminded him of the Zephyrians with their casual cruelty and assumption that might made right. When the pirates demanded that the crew surrender, Jake suggested a different plan. He knew the layout of their ship from studying salvaged vessels, and he had noticed weaknesses in their formation, working with Zara and Grix. Jake sabotaged the ship's main power grid to make it look like they were helpless. When the pirates boarded, they found what seemed like a damaged vessel with a frightened crew. But Jake had positioned his new friends throughout the ship with improvised weapons. When he gave the signal, they struck back with coordinated precision that caught the attackers completely off guard. The pirate leader was a brutal Sethran warrior who stood 8 feet tall and had armor that could stop most weapons. Jake faced him alone in the cargo bay with nothing but a plasma cutter and years of anger. The fight was quick and vicious. Jake used the alien size against him and his own smaller human frame to stay out of reach. When the dust settled, the pirate was dead and his crew was fleeing in their damaged ships. Vex looked at Jake with new respect as they watched the pirates retreat. The Corvani captain had seen many fighters in his long life, but never anyone who moved with such cold calculation mixed with burning determination. The other crew members started calling Jake the Ghost Walker because he seemed to appear and disappear like a spirit of vengeance. That night, Jake sat alone in the observation deck and stared out at the stars. For the first time since Earth's destruction, he felt something other than crushing grief. The anger was still there, burning like a small sun in his chest, but now it had direction and purpose. He thought about Lisa and Amy and made them a promise in the silence of space. Their deaths would not be meaningless. Somehow, someday, he would make the Zephyrians pay for what they had taken from him, and from all the other refugees scattered across the galaxy. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the world end. The morning had started like any other Tuesday on Earth, but now massive alien ships blocked out the sun like dark clouds of death. He gripped the metal railing so hard his knuckles turned white as he stared at the planet below through the thick glass windows of the UES Defiance. The alien ships were huge, beyond anything humans had ever built. Each one was the size of a city, and there were hundreds of them floating in space around Earth like angry metal gods. They had arrived without warning just 6 hours ago and immediately started shooting at everything that moved. The Zephyrian Empire had finally found humanity, and they had come to destroy it completely. Jake could see the bright flashes of plasma fire hitting Earth's surface from orbit. Every flash meant thousands of people were dying. Somewhere down there in the burning cities were his wife Lisa and his 8-year-old daughter Amy. They lived in Chicago, and the last communication from that area had been 3 hours ago. Since then, there had been only silence and the terrible bright flashes that turned cities into glass and ash. The human space fleet was fighting back, but it was like throwing rocks at a hurricane. Earth's ships were fast and the crews were brave, but their weapons barely scratched the alien armor. Jake watched the UES Liberty explode in a ball of fire as alien plasma tore through its hull like paper. Captain Ben Rodriguez and his crew of 200 were gone in an instant. Jake had served with Ben for 10 years, and now he was just scattered atoms floating in space. The communication system crackled to life, and Jake heard Admiral Kate Sullivan's voice from the command ship. Her words were calm, but Jake could hear the fear underneath them like a hidden current in a deep river. The Admiral was ordering all ships to protect the evacuation vessels that were trying to escape Earth's gravity well. Civilian transports packed with refugees were launching from every spaceport that still existed, but the alien ships were hunting them down one by one. Jake turned to his weapons officer, Danny Kim, who was sweating despite the cool air on the bridge. Danny had been trying to target the alien ships for hours, but their shields were too strong and their movements too fast. The young officer looked up at Jake with desperate eyes and shook his head. Nothing they did seemed to matter. The aliens were winning, and everyone knew it. Through his earpiece, Jake heard the final transmission from Earth's surface. It came from an emergency broadcast station in what used to be Denver. The voice belonged to Dr. Peter Hayes from the Global Defense Center, and his words cut through Jake's heart like a cold knife. The surface was lost. The cities were burning. Most of the population was dead or dying. The Zephyrian ground forces were landing to finish what their ships had started. Jake closed his eyes and thought about Lisa's laugh and the way Amy always hugged his leg when he came home from space missions. He thought about Sunday mornings in their small house and the garden Lisa loved so much. He thought about teaching Amy to fly her toy spaceship in the backyard, and the way she always asked if he would take her to the stars someday. Now the stars had come to them and brought only death. The bridge shook as alien weapons hit the Defiance's shields. The lights flickered and Jake could smell smoke from damaged systems. His ship was dying just like everything else humanity had built, but looking at his crew, Jake saw something that surprised him. These men and women were scared, but they were not broken. They were still fighting, even though they knew they could not win. Jake made a decision that would change everything. He ordered his helmsman Gary Chun to set a collision course with the largest alien ship. The massive enemy vessel was over 3 miles long and bristled with weapons that had been killing humans all day. Gary's hands shook as he entered the coordinates, but he did not question the order. The crew knew what Jake was planning, and none of them said a word against it. The Defiance turned toward the alien flagship like an arrow aimed at the heart of a giant. Jake opened a channel to the evacuation ships and told them to run as fast as they could. He was going to buy them time with his life and the lives of his crew. It was all he had left to give. As the distance closed, Jake thought about Earth one last time. The blue planet that had given birth to humanity was dying, but some of its children would survive among the stars. Maybe someday they would return home, or maybe they would build something new and better. Jake would never know, but he could give them the chance to try. The Defiance struck the alien ship's engine section at full speed, and both vessels disappeared in an explosion that lit up space like a new sun.